Hey everyone, so here's a situation I never thought I'd be in. My mum and sister recently reached out after 6 years of silence, and they're asking for my help in their new business. I gave them one condition to meet, and now they're acting like I'm being unreasonable. I'm starting to wonder if I might be wrong here, so I thought I'd lay out the whole story and see what you think. To give you some context, when I say family, I'm talking about my mum and my younger sister, Jess. I'm 28 and she's 24 now. Growing up, Jessica was always my mum's favourite. She was the golden child who could do no wrong, even when she clearly was in the wrong. I wouldn't say my mum treated me badly, but Jess definitely got away with everything. My dad, on the other hand, was more of a disciplinarian and tried to keep things fair between us. But he passed away unexpectedly from an aneurysm when I was in my second year of college. After that, it was just the three of us, and we all took it hard in different ways. Jess was only 16 when Dad passed, and it really shook her. She started acting out in ways I'd never seen before, going out late without telling anyone, drinking, smoking, and possibly even taking drugs. My mum finally had to start laying down some rules, and even though she didn't want to, she tried her best to keep Jess in line. She cut off her pocket money, threatened to ground her, and eventually, when nothing worked, she told Jess she'd call the police if she didn't stop. Our state has strict laws on underage drinking and drug use, so the threat was real, and it finally seemed to scare Jess enough to make her quit. She started hanging out with her old friends again, the ones who'd been a better influence, and things seemed to settle down. The last time I actually saw them in person was 6 years ago. I'd gone home for a short visit, and Jess's high school was hosting a charity bake sale. My mum had practically forced Jess to participate, hoping it would give her a bit of responsibility. Jess was on the planning committee, so Mum and I pitched in to help. We baked cookies and set up a stall to support her. I thought I was doing something nice by helping out and didn't realise how wrong things were about to go. Once the event ended, I had plans with friends to catch a movie, so I left quickly while Mum and Jess stayed behind to wrap things up. When I got back from the movie, everything seemed fine, and I headed back to college the next day not suspecting anything. Then, over the next few weeks, I noticed something odd. A bunch of people from high school unfollowed me on Instagram. It wasn't like I'd had any issues with them. I was still friendly with a few, and I couldn't think of any reason why they'd suddenly cut me off. After puzzling over it for a while, I decided to message one of them to ask what was going on. When I asked why they'd unfollowed me, they replied, "You should just be glad people haven't blocked you yet." I was stunned. They didn't explain further, and I felt completely in the dark. I tried reaching out to some of my old friends, but no one knew anything specific. They hadn't heard any rumors and were as clueless as I was. I felt like I was losing my mind trying to figure out what was happening. So I finally decided to ask my mum if she knew anything about it. I didn't expect her to, but at this point I was out of ideas. To my surprise, when I called her, she admitted right away that she knew what was going on. She explained that after the bake sale ended, Jess, as part of the committee, stayed behind with the others to count the money they'd raised. Apparently, at some point, when no one was watching, Jess managed to swipe nearly $2,000 from the funds. That's when things got messy. People quickly realized the money was missing, and they started recounting, hoping it was just a mistake. But after several rounds of counting, it became clear that someone had stolen it. At first, everyone suspected Jess, since she was the one who had access to the cash, but no one had any proof. My mum had figured out what happened too, but instead of holding Jess accountable, she decided to throw me under the bus. She told everyone that I had taken the money. She made up a whole story saying that I'd been struggling with a drinking problem, and because she'd stopped sending me extra money for school, I'd gotten desperate and taken the charity money. She told them that I'd grabbed it when she wasn't looking and left quickly to avoid suspicion. She said she had done it all to protect Jess's future. According to her, I was away at college and didn't have to face the people in our hometown, so she thought it wouldn't affect me much. But Jess, on the other hand, would still have to see all these people, and if they found out she'd stolen money meant for charity, they'd never let her live it down. So, in my mum's mind, saving Jess was the only option, even if it meant sacrificing my reputation. When she told me all this, I was speechless. Not only had she lied about me, but she'd also told everyone I was an alcoholic and thief, all to cover for my sister. The worst part? She didn't even seem sorry about it. She insisted it was the only way to protect Jess, and that since I didn't live there, it shouldn't matter to me. The whole situation crushed me. I was left with this horrible reputation, all because my mum wanted to protect Jess, and she wouldn't even consider clearing my name. When I told her she needed to tell people the truth, she flat out refused. She insisted that Jess had finally turned over a new leaf, and that if the truth got out, it would ruin all the progress she'd made. Apparently, Jess had stolen the money because Mum had cut off her allowance, and she'd wanted cash to go out with her friends. After they returned home from the bake sale, Mum told Jess this was the last time she'd protect her, and if she ever did something like this again, she'd be on her own. That was supposedly what finally snapped Jess back to reality. I argued with my mum, saying it wasn't fair to let people think I was a thief, but she wouldn't budge. She kept saying that my life was already sorted because I was about to graduate, and this was the least I could do for Jess. At that point, I was so frustrated that I just hung up. I couldn't believe the people who were supposed to be my family had done this to me. After that call, I debated for weeks whether I should go public with the truth, maybe post on Facebook or something. But in the end, I decided to stay quiet. I thought if my family couldn't even apologize, then I didn't owe them anything, including my silence. I decided I'd cut them off completely unless they reached out with an actual apology, and that's exactly what I did. I didn't contact them for 6 years, waiting for some acknowledgement of what they'd done, but none ever came. That's how I went through graduation and everything else with only my dad's family by my side. I told my grandparents what happened and they were horrified. They cut off contact with my mum and Jess too, and gradually, my dad's entire side of the family stopped speaking to them. For 6 years, I had no idea what they were up to, and honestly, I didn't care. They'd made it clear how little I meant to them, so why should I bother? And that was the end of it, until last week. Out of nowhere, I got an email from them. They didn't have my current phone number or address, but they found my email and reached out to tell me they're starting a new business. They'd both become real estate agents, and now they wanted to start their own real estate company. They were asking for help with funding since they'd heard I was doing well for myself. And they're not wrong. I've done well in my career and could afford to invest. But after 6 years of silence, I wasn't about to just hand over money. I called them back and set one simple condition. I'd only consider investing if they publicly apologized for lying about me stealing charity money. I wanted them to set the record straight, to tell everyone that they'd thrown me under the bus to save Jess. Until then, I wasn't interested. To say they didn't take it well would be an understatement. They accused me of being selfish and told me I should let bygones be bygones. They argued that since I no longer lived in our hometown, it shouldn't matter to me if people still believed the lie. But that's the thing. It does matter. They were so quick to destroy my reputation to protect Jess's, and now they wanted me to help them without any acknowledgement of the damage they'd done. After I gave my mum and Jess my condition, I could tell they were both taken aback. They hadn't expected me to stand up to them, let alone make such a clear demand. I could hear the tension in my mum's voice over the phone when she tried to brush off my request. She kept repeating that it wasn't fair for me to hold on to the past and that I should be more understanding because they'd both gone through a lot since then. 6 years is a long time to hold a grudge, she said, with this tone that tried to sound motherly but just came off as manipulative. I wasn't buying it. I told her this wasn't about holding a grudge. It was about respect. I wasn't asking them to do anything drastic, just to tell the truth. For years, they'd let people think I was some kind of thief and addict, and they hadn't once tried to set the record straight. Now, they were asking for my money but still wanted to dodge any responsibility for what they'd done. Then Jess chimed in. She tried the same angle, saying that bringing up old stories would only hurt people now, especially her. She even claimed she'd worked so hard to rebuild her life since those days, and that rehashing the past would be a massive setback for her. Hearing her say that was almost laughable. I told her straight up that I'd gone through college and built a life for myself while carrying the weight of her lie. The least she could do was acknowledge it. I think Jess realized that her words weren't going to sway me, so she quickly switched to guilt-tripping. She said that, unlike me, she still lived in our hometown, where people from high school would hear the truth, and it would destroy her reputation. She argued that since I'd left, the lie didn't really affect my life anymore. My mum backed her up, saying that an apology would be bad for business and could cost Jess the new connections she'd made. They acted like my request was a threat to their new venture and not a chance to make things right. When they finished, I took a deep breath and made my position clear one last time. I told them that if they expected me to invest, they needed to meet my one condition. It was simple: admit publicly that they'd lied about me and clear my name. If they couldn't do that, then there was no way I'd be part of their business. I thought I was being reasonable, especially after everything they'd put me through. But of course, that wasn't how they saw it. My mum scoffed, saying, "I can't believe you're willing to ruin your sister's future over something so petty." That was the final straw. I told her it wasn't petty to want my reputation back, and that if they were so worried about Jess's future, they should have thought of that before letting me take the fall. Then I hung up. I thought that would be the end of it. But a few days later, I got an email from my mum. She wrote a long message explaining that she regretted the events of the past, but she still wouldn't apologize publicly. She claimed that the situation was complicated, that tensions were high at the time, and that she'd just done what she thought was best for Jess's well-being. Not once did she admit that what she did was wrong. She only talked about how difficult it had been for her as a single mum after my dad's death. Reading it, I could tell she was trying to guilt me into letting it go, but it had the opposite effect. It only made me angrier. I responded to her email, telling her that regret wasn't the same as an apology, and that if she and Jess weren't willing to make things right, they shouldn't expect my help. I wasn't going to invest in people who still couldn't take responsibility for throwing me under the bus. I also reminded her that my dad's family had cut them off because of how they'd treated me, and that wasn't something I'd take lightly. The next few days were quiet, and I figured they'd finally accepted that I wasn't going to budge. But then, out of nowhere, I started getting messages from old friends and distant relatives, people I hadn't spoken to in years. My mum and Jess had apparently started telling people that I'd refused to help them in their time of need. They claimed they'd tried to make amends, but that I was holding on to bitterness and keeping the family divided. I could only shake my head at the irony. They made it sound like I was some heartless person refusing to let the past go, conveniently leaving out why I'd cut them off in the first place. A couple of friends even reached out, saying they'd heard about the situation and were surprised I wasn't willing to give them a second chance. I had to explain the whole story over and over, filling them in on what my mum and Jess had done 6 years ago and why I'd demanded an apology. Most of them understood, but it was exhausting. Once again, my mum and Jess were putting me in a position where I had to defend myself against their lies. Eventually, I decided enough was enough. I wasn't going to let them control the narrative or drag my name through the mud again. So I sat down, wrote out the entire story and posted it online. I didn't name names, but I made it clear what had happened, why I'd cut contact, and what my mum and Jess were trying to do now. I was careful to keep it factual, sticking to the events and letting people judge for themselves. I also added that I wasn't looking for sympathy. I just wanted people to know the truth so I could finally put it to rest. The response was overwhelming. Friends, relatives, and even people who'd only heard bits and pieces reached out to express their support. Some were shocked. Others apologized for not realizing what I'd gone through. But almost everyone understood why I was done with my mum and Jess. For the first time, I felt like I was finally being seen. Like the lie that had followed me for years was starting to lose its grip. A few days after my post went up, I received a final email from my mum. She was furious, saying that I'd ruined any chance of us ever being a family again, and that my stubbornness had forced her and Jess into a corner. But there was no apology, no acceptance of responsibility, just anger that her plan hadn't worked. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. I talked to my grandparents after that, filling them in on everything, and they assured me I'd made the right choice. They told me that if my mom and Jess couldn't even apologize after all these years, they weren't worth my time or my energy. They reminded me that real family wouldn't have put me in this position in the first place, and that if my mum and Jess ever came around, it would have to be on their own terms, not because they wanted something from me. For the first time in years, I felt a real sense of closure. I realized that I didn't need their apology or their acknowledgement to move on. All I needed was the truth to be out in the open, for people to understand what had happened, and for me to be free of the burden they'd placed on me. After putting the story out there, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. Years of anger and frustration had finally been voiced, and I didn't have to keep explaining myself to everyone who heard my mum and Jess's twisted version of the story. I'd put it all out in the open, and the truth was there for anyone who cared to know. I thought that would be the end of it. For a while, things actually went quiet. I went back to focusing on my work and spending time with friends, feeling lighter than I had in years. My grandparents checked in often, and every time they reassured me that I'd made the right decision. They reminded me that they'd seen firsthand what my mum and Jess had put me through, and they knew I'd been right to cut them off. For the first time, I started to feel like I could just move on with my life without constantly looking over my shoulder. Then a few weeks later, another email from my mum landed in my inbox. This time her tone had changed. Gone was the anger and indignation from before. Instead, she wrote that she needed to see me and that Jess wanted to apologize as well. She claimed they both felt awful for everything that had happened, that they'd been selfish and unfair, and that they just wanted to talk things over and heal as a family. At first, I didn't respond. After years of being let down, lied to, and manipulated, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another attempt to pull me back in. I forwarded the email to my grandparents, and they were just as wary as I was. They reminded me that a real apology would have come years ago, without strings attached or demands for money. But over the next few days, something kept nagging at me. Despite everything, I couldn't ignore the part of me that still cared, the part that remembered the good moments with my mum and Jess before things got so twisted. I'd spent years telling myself I didn't need them, that I was better off on my own. But the truth was, I missed the family I thought I had, even if they weren't the people I needed them to be. I didn't want to be bitter forever. I just wanted peace. So, after a lot of back and forth with my grandparents, I decided to respond. I wrote back to my mom and told her that if she and Jess genuinely wanted to talk, we could set up a time to meet. I told them that I wasn't looking for an apology or a reunion if it wasn't real, and that if they just wanted my money, they could forget it. I wanted them to understand that if they came, it had to be for the right reasons. A few days later, we set a time, and my mum and Jess agreed to come over to my apartment. The whole day before they arrived, I was a mess of emotions. Part of me was afraid they'd just come with more excuses, while another part of me hoped that maybe, just maybe, they'd realize the damage they'd done. I tried to keep my expectations low, but it was hard not to feel some hope creeping in. When they finally arrived, the tension was thick. We sat down in my small living room, and for a moment no one said anything. Then my mum broke the silence with a soft, almost nervous apology. She said that she knew she'd hurt me, that she'd let her own fears and Jess's struggles overshadow her responsibilities as a mother, and that she was truly sorry. She admitted that she'd been unfair and selfish, and that she'd never considered how much damage her lie would do to my life. As she spoke, I could feel years of anger and disappointment bubbling up, but I kept my cool. I listened, watching her closely, waiting for the usual excuses, but this time, there were none. She simply acknowledged what she'd done and told me she was sorry. Jess chimed in too, saying that she knew she'd been a nightmare to deal with back then, that she'd been selfish and reckless, and that she owed me more than an apology. She admitted she'd messed up her life and dragged me down with her, all because she didn't want to face the consequences of her own actions. For the first time, I could see genuine regret in their faces. They weren't asking for anything, not even my forgiveness. They were just laying it all out, finally owning up to everything they'd done. We talked for hours, working through the hurt and resentment that had been festering for years. My mum explained that after my dad's death, she'd felt completely lost, struggling to hold things together for Jess while grieving herself. She admitted that she'd leaned too heavily on me to be the strong one, and had overlooked the fact that I was just a kid dealing with loss too. By the end of the conversation, I felt a strange sense of closure. I didn't forgive them outright. Years of damage don't just vanish in one conversation, but I felt like I could finally let go of the anger that had been weighing me down. I could see that they were genuinely sorry, and that meant more to me than any amount of money or reputation. Before they left, my mum and Jess assured me they weren't asking for an investment anymore. They said they realized they'd overstepped, and they just wanted to rebuild a relationship with me, no strings attached. They even offered to reach out to anyone they'd lied to in the past and set the record straight. I told them it wasn't necessary. The people who mattered to me already knew the truth, and the rest didn't matter anymore. After they left, I felt lighter, like I'd finally put down a heavy weight I'd been carrying for far too long. It didn't erase the years of hurt, but it gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. I'd held on to my anger because I thought it was the only way to protect myself, but letting it go felt like the first real step toward healing. Since that day, we've started reconnecting slowly, and I keep my boundaries clear. I'm not jumping into a full-on family reunion, but we're taking small steps. I told them that if they want to be part of my life, they have to earn that trust back over time. They agreed, and for once they seemed to understand. They didn't push or ask for favors. They just took my terms as they were. I've shared all this with my grandparents, who were cautiously supportive. They reminded me that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and that I have every right to set boundaries. They just wanted to see me happy. And for the first time, I feel like I'm on the path to that. It's been a few months since that meeting with my mum and Jess, and things have been surprisingly calm. I wouldn't say everything is perfectly healed or that we're suddenly close again, but there's a peace I didn't expect to feel so soon. We've managed to stay in touch without any of the usual drama, and I feel like I finally have a bit of control over the relationship. The biggest difference this time is that my mum and Jess seem genuinely willing to respect my boundaries. After years of feeling like they only reached out to me when they needed something, I was cautious at first, but they didn't push. They just let things unfold naturally. They haven't brought up their business since that first meeting, and there's been no hint of them trying to guilt me or ask for favors. They seem to understand that if they want to be in my life, they have to take it at my pace. We started small, with short calls every few weeks and the occasional text message. My mum has kept her tone light, asking about work, my friends, or my grandparents. Jess has done the same, often apologizing again whenever the topic of our past comes up, as if she's still trying to make up for what happened. It's been strange to get used to this side of them, a version that actually listens instead of manipulating, but I can see that they're trying. For once, they're putting in the effort to respect my needs instead of only thinking about their own. A few weeks ago, Jess texted me to say she was visiting our hometown and ended up running into some people we went to high school with. She mentioned that she'd told them the truth about what happened, that it had been her who stole the money at the bake sale, not me. She didn't do it with any fanfare or expectation of praise. She just quietly admitted her mistake, and apparently they'd been shocked but surprisingly understanding. They told her they were glad she'd finally cleared the air, and even joked that they'd always had a feeling something didn't quite add up. When Jess told me this, I didn't know what to say. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot to know she'd taken that step without me asking her to. I told my grandparents about Jess's gesture, and they were pleased to hear that she'd taken responsibility. My grandpa even said, "It sounds like she's finally growing up." And honestly, I think he's right. Jess isn't the reckless teenager she used to be, and I can see that she's trying to be someone I can respect again. It's been a long road, and I'm not naive enough to think things are fixed overnight, but I feel like I can finally breathe. We decided to spend Thanksgiving together this year for the first time since we went out of contact. My grandparents were supportive but cautious, reminding me to keep my expectations realistic. They offered to host, so we all gathered at their place. I was nervous, but it actually turned out to be one of the best holidays I'd had in years. My mum and Jess were humble and respectful, and for the first time I didn't feel any of the old tension. We laughed, shared stories, and even talked about my dad. It felt like a glimpse of what our family could have been all along. That evening, Jess pulled me aside and thanked me for giving her a chance to make things right. She told me she'd spent years feeling like she'd ruined any chance of a relationship with me, and that she was genuinely grateful for the opportunity to rebuild. She also promised that no matter what happened, she'd never take my forgiveness for granted. It was a vulnerable moment, one that reminded me just how much had changed since the days when I was the older sister who had it all together, while she was the reckless younger sibling. After Thanksgiving, I feel more optimistic about the future. I don't know if we'll ever be the kind of close-knit family that others might take for granted, but for the first time, I feel like we have a real shot at something meaningful. I've learned that forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about making room for a future that isn't controlled by old wounds. Letting go of my resentment has been freeing, and I can finally see my mum and Jess as people who, despite their flaws, are trying to make things right. This experience has also made me appreciate the family who stood by me when things were darkest. My grandparents, who never wavered in their support, and the friends who believed in me when my own family didn't. I'm grateful for the strength they gave me to stand up for myself, even when it was painful. They showed me that family isn't about shared blood. It's about showing up when it matters most. I'm still taking things one step at a time. Jess and I have started talking about meeting up for coffee here and there, and my mum and I occasionally chat on the phone about small things like movies or books we've both read. I don't know exactly where these new connections will lead, but I'm open to seeing where they go. For now, that's enough. If I could tell my younger self anything, it would be that it's okay to set boundaries and demand respect even from family. Forgiveness doesn't make you weak. It frees you from carrying pain that isn't yours to hold on to. I feel like I'm finally letting go of the past, not to forget it, but to allow myself to live beyond it. So here's to new beginnings. Not perfect, not without scars, but real. And that's more than I ever expected. And maybe that's enough. Story 2. Parents leave it over the house I purchased for her. I stopped paying, therefore it was sold. Alright, so here's the sequence of events. See this. I work my butt off in tech and am 28. Living modestly, splitting a flat with 2 roommates helps one conserve every dollar. Although they have never been financially steady either, I would not label my parents as impoverished. Over the years, my family have experienced their fair share of financial hardships. My dad particularly always changes occupations, occasionally laid off in search of other means of income. He occasionally experimented with other fields. If you know what I mean, they have always been on the brink of barely surviving. Growing up, my sister and I had somewhat different treatment. She is 3 years younger than him, but man, she has always been the favourite. She could never truly do any wrong, so they allowed her act whatever she desired. She left high school without intending to attend college, just drifted about taking odd jobs here and there and dropped out. I was the conscientious one meantime. Perry, well, she wasn't going to, hence my parents always had high hopes for me and constantly hinted that I had to be the one to make it. They so spread their funds thinly and borrowed money to get me through tech school. They were depending on me to come through and made it quite evident that this was my chance to make something of myself. They were honest about how they gave up for me, about how they may have spent that money on themselves or put for retirement. But rather they made investments in my future. Actually, back then I saw nothing illegal about it. Indeed, they are acting in line what any parent would have done, right? They wanted me to be successful. I so lowered my head and worked hard, believing one day I would pay them back and everything would be well. I started a decent career following tech school. Though it wasn't much, it was enough to start paying back some of the college loans and saving, therefore relieving some of the burden. I would periodically forward them some money. Not too much, as I was still organising my life. Enough to assist, though. Dad would remind me of the great sacrifices they had made every time I sent anything, implying that more they would do. This was primarily via subdued remarks like, "Don't forget who brought you here or where you came from." Though quite subtle, I understood the meaning. Then one evening I'm back home paying a few days' visit. We are seated around the dinner table simply chatting. This is the first time I've been able to take some actual time off. Dad suddenly mentions how they are still renting and how difficult it is to not have a location of personal call through. He discusses the rent increases, the noisy neighbours, and the exhausting nature of moving every few years when the lease expires. Then he squarely stares at me and adds, "We're just wondering when we can stop living on rent and finally settle down, you know?" I sort of dismiss it as he seems to be only ranting, but then he leaves. "You ought to consider purchasing us a house, son. Right now you are doing great. To bring you here, we have done our share." Halfway through my lunch, I'm seated there staring at him like, "Wait, what exactly?" They struck me as dead serious. My mother interrupts, all encouraging, and says it would truly mean the world to us. Somewhere we may refer to as our own only, you can bring that dream to pass. I felt imprisoned at that instant. I had no idea what to say while they were right there fixated on me. They did pay for my schooling and help me growing up on one hand, but they also bought a complete house for me. My career is only getting begun. And here they were, speaking like I should already have enough saved to cover top-notch living costs, plus a property purchase price. Saying, "Dad, I'm hardly paying rent myself," I attempted to brush it off. "Not even for you folks, but only for me. I cannot afford a house." But they laughed it off, giving me a knowing glance as though they thought I would sort it out finally. They kept dropping hints over the following few months. Every phone conversation, every time I visited, there would be a statement like, "It would be so lovely to settle down somewhere, or all we want is a little place, nothing large." They would also follow up with the customary reminders about sacrifices, how they had to empty their money from my university, how much they went without, and how they lacked choice. Not even able to dispute with them. Everything they said was accurate. They did made sacrifices and had invested everything in my future, but it began to feel as though they were also depriving me options, like they were propelling me toward a corner. Their instrument was guilt, and they used it deftly. I caved eventually. Years of saving and cutting back helped me to scrape enough for a down payment. I wanted to do it for them, partially because I felt I owed them, and also because I believed it would at last bring all the guilt trips to a stop. I so got them a house. Nothing wild, simply a small space in a peaceful neighbourhood. It was theirs, though. I thought, this is a fantastic thing, even if I still lived in an apartment. At last they will be pleased. Perhaps today they will let me live my life. They were delighted for the first several months. Every contact I received from them focused on how wonderful the house was, how cosy they felt, how happy they were of at last having a place to call home. They showed it to their relatives and friends, and for once it felt as though the continual strain was released. They had their house, and at last I was free to start concentrating on my own objectives. Though I had assumed it would cause distance, it didn't. The house came up just more. Mum would note how they were creating a real home and all the minor improvements they desired, suggesting that it would be fantastic if I could assist with those expenses too. Dad would remind me of the mortgage payments and emphasize how every one of us is helping to bring this about. Every time I would phone, there seemed to be something fresh they would want to talk about the house. Still, I maintained paying the mortgage and sent additional money whenever I could to finish it off earlier. Though my life seemed to be work, save and repeat, it seemed as though I was nearing something excellent. I had, after all, brought their fantasy to pass. That seemed to be what counted. But I would get that sinking sensation every time I checked my personal funds. I was still barely surviving, giving all these sacrifices for a place I could not even dwell in while they lounged pleasantly in what ought to be our achievement. Now that my parents owned the house, I reasoned things will finally cool. You know, I assumed they would retreat somewhat. I mean, I'd done something rather significant for them, but the entire beloved child thing with my sister Perry kept resurfacing. And it seemed like the more I volunteered, the more they came depending on me. Though I told myself it was nothing, I was beginning to feel more like a wallet than a kid Dot. Though everyone else save my parents can clearly see Perry has always been treated differently. She grew up never under any expectations. She left high school early, engaged in activities that didn't really fit her, and sort of wandered from job to job. From their perspective, though, she was only discovering her alternatives or finding herself. They constantly managed to capture her decisions in some forgiving light. I was advised to be focused, work hard, and generally build something out of myself so I could help the family. It was really evident from my high school years who they were banking on. About my academics, professional path, and whatever move I made, I got pounded. Perry may bring home FS on her report card, and Mum would explain to her that not everyone is suited for school. She could do nothing wrong. I was the one supposed to set the standard. They considered me as their insurance, the one who would go out to see to it everyone was looked after. Perry received everything handed to her. Hence she was like the family pet except. Here I am paying for the house while they see it as her place as well. At first I paid hardly any thought to it. Technically it was their residence, hence if she wanted to visit or stay for a weekend, it was not really my concern. Then I would hear these strange remarks from my folks on how Perry truly enjoyed the new location, or on how she had been spending days at a time. They even began discussing how fantastic it would be if she moved in close by. That small clue continued showing up every time I visited or gave a call. Every single interaction with them began to resemble some variant of "it's so nice for Perry to have stability around. Perhaps she could live here until she works things out." They would say it casually, as though it were not really significant, just some ideas to consider. But I'd worked my ass off to get that house for them, not to pay for a place Perry could crash whenever she felt like it. A few months in, I came to see her tiny visits were more than simply visits. She was indeed residing there. One day I questioned Mum straightforwardly as I wanted to avoid drawing snap decisions. She responded vaguely, something like, "Oh well, she's just here looking after things around the house." Assisting with what though? Perry was there, lazing about as like she owned the house every time I visited. One weekend I made the decision to drop over without warning. I wanted to see for myself what was actually going on, hence I hadn't notified them I was coming. When I arrived there, nobody else opens the door. Not my folks. Perry's here. Looking quite at ease, she is in pajamas like this was her place. She asked, "Oh, what are you doing here?" Clearly startled to see me, as though I were the one invading. Just standing there a little stunned. I recall trying to understand why she was acting as she had been for weeks. When I get in, her stuff is all over the house. Around were clothes and bags and cosmetics. She had moved in almost exactly, not at all concerning it. "Where are Mum and Dad?" I ask her. She shrugs, saying they're out shopping or something and won't be back for some time. I sit down trying to seem cool, but inside I'm raging. We sit in this uncomfortable silence for a few minutes and I simply can't stand it anymore. I leave. "Are you thus briefly staying here?" She shrugs once more, then says, "Well, you know, it's a nice place. Mum and Dad don't mind me hanging out here." I wanted to tell her off, say something like, "Yeah, well, maybe I mind," but I knew that would blow up into something bigger. So instead I just nodded, biting my tongue, trying not to lose it. Right there, when my parents came back, I brought it up casually, saying something like, "Hey, I didn't realize Perry was staying here." They just laughed it off, saying she needed a place to stay for a while because things weren't working out with her roommates. I knew exactly what that meant. She'd probably gotten kicked out or couldn't pay her part of the rent. But of course, my parents would never actually say that to them. It was just another harmless little adjustment in her life. Nothing was ever her fault. That night, we all sat down for dinner, and the entire time they kept praising her for helping them out around the house. I couldn't believe it. They were acting like she was some kind of hero for being there. Well, I'm the one actually paying for the place. Every time I tried to bring up something related to the house, they'd steer the conversation back to Perry. How good it was for her. How she was finally getting her feet on the ground and how this was just what she needed to get on the right track. It was like I wasn't even part of the picture anymore. They were making this house about her, as if my sacrifices didn't exist. After that night, I couldn't shake this feeling that I'd been duped. I didn't sign up to buy a house for Perry. I bought it for them, thinking I'd be giving them security, but it started feeling more like I was financing Perry's new life. I left that visit feeling frustrated, like I'd walked into a trap I didn't even know was there. It was becoming clearer that my parents had a blind spot the size of a house when it came to Perry. I couldn't help but feel like I was being taken advantage of, and it was getting hard to ignore. The next time I talked to my parents, they dropped another blow on me. They started talking about how settled Perry seemed to feel in the house, and how great it would be if she had her own space. I tried to laugh it off, saying, well, she's got to find her own way eventually, right? But they just looked at me with these blank stares, like I wasn't getting it. And I realized then that they had a different idea about what her own space meant. All right, so here's where things went completely off the rails after that last visit where I'd walked in on Perry just lounging around the house. I figured she'd be moving out soon. Or at the very least, she'd help out if she was planning to stay longer. I thought maybe she was just crashing there temporarily, like we all do when we're going through something. But a couple of weeks later, my mum calls me up all casual and drops a grenade on me. They'd actually moved out. Yeah, you read that right. My parents moved out of the house I bought for them, and Perry had moved in full-time instead. I sat there, phone in hand, trying to process it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mean, I bought that house specifically for my parents, thinking it would give them the stability and peace of mind they deserved. And now, out of nowhere, they just handed it over to Perry. No heads up, no conversation, just a casual announcement. Like I'd have no problem with it, I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Why would you move out? This house was for you and Dad, not for Perry. My mum just laughed, brushing it off like it was no big deal. Oh, honey, we needed a fresh start. Besides, Perry needs the house more than we do right now. She's trying to get her life together, and having a stable place to live will help her a lot. She said it so matter-of-factly, like it was the most logical thing in the world. She's trying to get her life together, she explained. Like that justified everything. She needs stability, especially if she's planning to have a family eventually. I was simply sitting there startled, trying to put my brain around what she just said. Stability. What about the steadiness I'd been striving toward? What about all the sacrifices I'd made to make sure my folks had a respectable home to live in? And now, out of nowhere, Perry was simply taking control, and they hadn't even thought to ask whether I was all right with it. Finally, I asked them outright out. So are you saying Perry's living there full-time now? And what about the mortgage? Who's paying for that? My mum's tone altered, seeming almost defensive, like I was accusing her of something. Well, honey, you're doing well for yourself now, aren't you? It shouldn't be a huge concern for you to keep paying a bit longer. Besides, she's family. That's where it was. The phrase is once more, you're doing great. As though all the sacrifices I had made and my diligence meant they had free access to anything I had created for myself. Though I attempted to calm off, it felt like a slap in the face. This is not what we agreed upon, Mom remarked. I bought the house for Dad, and you not, so Perry could live rent-free while I pay the bills. She groaned, sounding annoyed as though I were the one acting irrationally. We assumed you would get it. She is suffering and has less possibilities than you do. We only need you to contribute a little bit more. You have always been the responsible one. I was hardly hanging on at that time. Help a while later. Mum, I pay for everything entirely. Not just a tiny assist. I've been paying more each month to expedite payoff, assuming it would help your stability. You now tell me you gave it to Perry without even asking me. My dad joined in, then tried to be cool and fair, but he came out as more patronizing than anything. Son, we didn't believe it would be such a huge problem. Perry could very benefit from your financial stability. It's simply till she can walk again. Starts to stand again, I replied, my voice rising even as I tried to control it. Her entire life she has been recovering from injuries. When will my obligation to make things right for her stop? They just sat there staring at me as though I was the one who had transgressed. At last, my mother added, perhaps we shouldn't have imagined you would be so eager to support your own family. Her phrasing, like I was the evil person, made sense, just directly smacked me hard. They would always find a way to turn anything I did against me, saying, "Hey, this needs to change, I got up to go. She pays her share or you guys handle it." But I'm not only paying for Perry to live free in the house, I am giving all up for. They replied nothing, simply stared at one another, clearly dissatisfied with me, as like I was somehow letting them down. I felt more disappointed and deceived driving home than I had ever experienced. They had done this, blindsiding me with a choice that fundamentally changed my life. Then they had the arrogance to make me feel bad for not wanting to go along. It felt like all my effort, everything I had done for them had no bearing. Thinking maybe I was overreacting, that maybe I was being selfish for demanding a little say in how my money was being spent, I attempted to cool off back at my house. But the more I considered it, the more it struck in me that I wasn't entirely irrational. Who really turns over a residence someone else is paying for without first consulting them? Which type of parents engage in this? And what sort of sister simply moves in without trying to help out, without even thinking through maybe this wasn't fair? I thought of myself as at a crossroads. What was next if I stayed with this? Just because I was doing well, would I be required to pay for every little item they wanted to give Perry? Would I always be the backup scheme? The one they could count on any time they needed money? I considered all the years I had laboured to reach here, all the sacrifices I had made. I had lived my life attempting to bring them pride, ascending so I could provide them with a better existence. And now, having done it, I felt as though I was only a tool for them, not a son with aspirations of his own, but only a wallet. And Perry. She lacked even the slightest thankfulness. It was just expected of me to intervene and correct things for her any time she needed it. As I considered it, I came to see something had to change. This was never going to stop. I couldn't keep paying for everything without imposing some limits. Should they consider me as their financial safety net, they would never stop consuming. I also never could live my own life. I thus decided that, even if it might pain them, I would have to establish some strict limitations. Not even if they lacked understanding. Ultimately, I had spent too much time giving everything up for a family who considered my accomplishment as theirs to squander. And I had more dignity than that. That last call made it quite evident that I had to make some difficult choices. The whole thing had spiraled out of hand, and without some strict limitations, they would keep draining me until I had nothing left. My parents changed my house into Perry's, moved out without saying anything, and had the arrogance to utilize my additional money to finance their rent. Their lack of any problems with any of it indicated they would keep on unless I set ground rules. I considered it over a few days. I wanted to approach this coolly, not only arrive armed. The schedule was straightforward. I would tell them I wasn't going to keep sending extra money, and if Perry wanted to live there, she had to start making mortgage payments or move out. Time was for some actual limits. I thus informed my parents we needed to have a face-to-face conversation. Though not excited, they consented, and I went to their new location. When I arrived, the tension was strong. They clearly understood what this was about. We sat down, and I didn't spend any time straightforwardly reaching the subject. Look, I started maintaining the calmest voice I could. The bank told me the extra money I've been sending hasn't gone toward the mortgage. Being kept in the dark about where my money is going bothers me. Try to dismiss it, Dad said. Not a huge deal at all. Since we moved out of Perry, we needed the additional to pay rent. You are doing well. We assumed you wouldn't be interested in it. You're performing nicely. Once more line? Hearing it made me rather ill. They utilized it every time. They looked to me for something, like the fact that I had worked hard somehow. It became my responsibility to resolve all their issues. I inhaled deeply and said, "But Dad, I paid for this house for you, not for Perry. And the money was meant to pay off the mortgage more quickly, not cover second place for you. I cannot keep on like this." My mother looked at me disappointedly, the kind she had honed over years. "Honey, Perry is in need of consistency. She does not have your similar chances. We assumed you would be interested in helping your sister." I became rather annoyed and could feel my tolerance running thin. "Mum, I am already lending assistance. I acquired the house. I even sent more as I have been paying the mortgage. Perry, an adult though, She has to help if she intends to live there. Not fair to me, is this? Dad shook his head, clearly irritated. Dot. You are quite selfish. We have done for you quite a bit. Surely it's time you returned a small gift to the family. Though I felt my rage growing, I controlled it. I am returns. I have been providing more than plenty. I have rights nevertheless to impose boundaries. Right now, the restriction is that I'm only paying the minimum mortgage going forward. Perry either has to find somewhere else to live or chip in if she stays there. Both of them glanced at me, obviously dissatisfied, but I didn't back off. I knew precisely what I wanted to say after practicing this in my thoughts so many times. I wouldn't let guilt force me into succumbing. I said, this is not about not caring. It quote s about justice. I deserve some regard as I worked hard to reach here. Though I'm glad to help you people, I find this unacceptable. Mum's side tried one final time. We assumed you would be understanding. Family watches out for one another. Family also respects one another. I answered, more determined than ever. Though I have done all I can to help you, I have to draw the line someplace. I have to give my personal life some attention as well. Perry has to help if she wants to stay. If not, I'll figure something else. Leave the home. There was a lengthy, awkward quiet. I could tell they didn't know how to respond. They were not used to my talking like this. Eventually, my dad murmured, "We'll speak with Perry." He obviously wasn't thrilled, but he knew this time I was not backing down. I left both relieved and exhausted. I had for once spoken up for myself without feeling bad about it. At that time, I didn't care. I had no idea what they'd do or what Perry would say. It was time they began to appreciate that I had done more than my share. I didn't hear from them during the next few days. Not one call or one message. Just quiet. I started to worry whether I had gone too far, but I knew I had done the correct thing every time I went back over the chat. Years of bending over backward were finally time to put my own needs first. One afternoon then, my mother phoned Dot. Her voice was quiet, somewhat resigned. She informed me they spoke with Perry, and she agreed to start making mortgage payments. Just little, but it was something. She sounded let down, as like she still couldn't believe I had actually requested it. I didn't let that disturb me, though. That is encouraging to learn, I said, brief as it is. I wanted none to stretch this out or start another guilt trip session. For once, they had really honoured a limit I had imposed. Hanging there, I had an unusual spectrum of feelings. Though unhappy as well, I felt relieved. Having to fight with my own parents to convince them to value what I'd fought so hard for never seemed like it would come to pass. But I knew it had to happen if I hadn't lately started to defend myself. My life would be this permanently, continually giving, always expected to fix everyone else's errors. In the next weeks, things were stiller. They pushed less, and I wasn't informed of any more abrupt changes. For once, I felt as though I was really living my life for me, not only as a backup for everyone else. I wouldn't say everything is fixed, though at least now I have set a boundary. I know they still rely on me as the responsible one, and I would not hesitate to remind them of where that boundary resides should they cross it. I arrived here years ago and am not returning. I realized it was time to leave that last chat. I made rules, tried everything logical with them, including making a concession to maintain equity. Nevertheless, it always turned out the same regardless of what I did. Not as a kid with own life and aspirations, but more as their safety net. I was seen. I thus decided what I ought to have done long ago. I gave up making the mortgage payments. I came ready for the aftermath. The calls started practically right away. My mum called every day, perhaps many times a day at first, leaving these lengthy, winded voicemails about family responsibilities and their disappointment of me. She would remind me of all the things they had done for me growing up, making it sound as like I was some self-serving idiot who had dropped his family. Then my dad started to participate. His voicemails were more annoyed and more precise. "We raised you to support your family," he would remark. "We assumed you would be constantly at our side." To be honest, though, I felt numb about it. I felt nothing at last. Not guilty. They would have seized advantage of anything I could have given them. Now this was not my concern. They ran out of means to get to me finally after I kept rejecting their calls. Still, that had no effect on them. They began phoning from various numbers, occasionally even borrowing friends' cell phones to attempt to surprise me. Sure enough, it would be another voicemail from my mum droning on about how family doesn't desert one another, attempting to guilt-trip me right back into covering the mortgage. I would see an unfamiliar number flash up and hesitate just in case it was urgent. But this time I was not having it. Every number I could identify was blocked. When fresh ones surfaced, I blocked those too as well. Realizing that for them this was normal struck me as the toughest thing to deal with. Family meant to them, I would give non-stop without asking questions. They never considered that I may have dreams and my own life. With no one covering the mortgage, they saw me as nothing except a bank account with a voice on the other end of the telephone. Things broke rapidly. The bank owned the house a few months later, and shortly long it was put for auction. Though there was a bit of sting, I had been anticipating it. This was the house I meant to have given my parents, the house I had given up so much for. Ultimately, though, it wasn't truly my loss. They concluded Perry was entitled to it, and I stopped wasting money into a location I had no influence over. I've had enough. Perry and her husband had to move out of the house sold as they lacked means of payment for it. Perry too began making calls, but by then I had already blocked her phone. Her sob tale made me want nothing, was not interested in learning about how unjust it was for me to be depriving her stability. She had been given every chance to volunteer, to at least share some accountability. She had not done any of it though, and I was not going to listen to her lament about it. Right now. Then arrived the guilt-ridden notes from my parents. They continued even after the home was demolished. Calling me unappreciative and selfish, they attempted to make me feel as like I had betrayed them. They said things like, "We never believed you would just walk away from family." To me, though, it seemed as though I had done nothing except provide for my family at the price of my own life. All they saw was that the money had stopped coming. That was sufficient to make me the villain in their narrative. They didn't give a damn about my buying a house for them with money I might have used for myself, or about years I had sacrificed my own objectives to help them. They were not interested in my merely attempting to make a reasonable decision for them. I would turn into the bad person. The moment I got to my feet defending myself, my parents ended up renting a smaller apartment in a less expensive neighborhood, last I heard. Perry had to at last come up with a fresh strategy for herself since they could afford to maintain the kind of life they had known. Based on what I know, my parents have had to cut back. They are managing, though. Additionally, Perry, her regular handouts are no longer. She is on her own for what seems like her first time in life. Though I might have felt terrible about it previously, today I view it differently. She called for this wake-up alert. Perhaps now she will see she needs to put in her own effort without me as a fallback. For me, at last I acquired my own apartment. It's not fancy. One modest flat I pay for on my own terms, knowing that this is my place and that I'm not always working solely to support someone else's life lends a sort of tranquility to me. I can at last begin to save for a future, just mine. One objective I'm really enthusiastic about is eventually owning my own house. One that is really mine. Looking back, it's crazy how many years it took for me to see the reality. I reminded myself I was acting in line with appropriate behavior. That family meant giving all you possessed, but somewhere along the road, family started to be a means of consumption without ever considering the costs. Though it's unpleasant, I needed this insight. I represented their money, not only their child. And even if it hurt, it has guided me toward the line I ought to have drawn years ago. Given hindsight's 20/20ths, I suppose they are correct. If I had known how things would turn out, I may have behaved differently. At the same time, though, maybe this was the only means I could perceive the reality. All those years of remorse and all those offerings. Now I see it was more about control than love. They did not desire a boy who was content and self-reliable. They yearned for someone who looked after them unquestioningly. I'm not sure whether they will ever accept what's occurred. For all I know, I will always be the selfish son who left his family when they most needed him. Really, though. I'm good with it. They are free to believe whatever narrative helps them feel better and think whatever they choose. Ultimately, though, I know that by leaving, I did the right thing. I am now at last free to concentrate on me. I have plans and am saving. Creating a life free from depending on first-time bailing others out for future seems to be mine, and I can't even explain how wonderful it feels to know that the things I labour for will really benefit my own life, not merely vanish into someone else's need. Though I took a long time to get here, I have no regrets. Actually, I'm glad. I had the will to change once at last I realised the reality family should reflect love and respect rather than responsibility and sacrifice. I'm at last free to live by that as well. Story 3. Stepsister accused me falsely of a family, cut off me. The reality, though, surfaced now. Alright, so this whole issue begins when I was 18. And really, I still find it difficult to understand. Only 2 years older than me, my stepsister Jade chose to accuse me of something truly terrible, like life-ruining, sort of horrible. I quote me talking about the type of thing that may ruin families and cause others to view you like you're trash. Though it's honestly still difficult for me to say, she accused me of attacking her. Not even a small rumour or whatever. She murmured gently to someone. It was a planned, full-bodied allegation. The worst aspect is also here. Actually, my parents who reared me, who I felt understood me better than anyone, believed her. Allow me to back up somewhat. From his second marriage, Jade was my dad's stepdaughter. She entered my life around 10 years ago. First of all, everything were good. We were young people caught in an odd family mashup. But things changed with our age. Particularly from her dad and her mother. Jade was always somewhat needy, always seeking attention and aid. She was also quite eager to get it. Since, honestly, I didn't want to get engaged in her drama, I just kind of remained out of it and did my own thing. She battled a lot with her mother, usually with reference to money or education. Though her mother wasn't exactly happy about covering the cost permanently, Jade had all these great ambitions about attending graduate school and doing something amazing. Once, they got into a big fight over it. I recall Jade sobbing when she came over to my mother and complaining she felt abandoned and unsupported. Although my mother consoled her and said she understood, really I felt it was excessive. Jade, mother wasn't chopping off anything. I sort of agreed since she simply wanted her to start paying her own way. Naturally, though, I kept that view to myself, at least until the day that destroyed everything. Here is therefore the course of the day. Maybe on a visit to friends or at some function my folks were out. I'm not clear exactly. When Jade arrived up at the door looking very furious, I was home by myself. She entered without asking at all, set her luggage down on the floor and collapsed into the couch. She started off anyhow, even though I didn't want to hear whatever conflict she had gone through with her mother this time. It turned out just as usual. Her mother was not showing understanding. Nobody thought her blah blah was credible. I tried to be kind and attentive, but this time I simply couldn't keep my mouth under control. Tell her, look, possibly your mother is correct. She has done much for you, and perhaps it's time you begin supporting yourself a bit if you wish to continue your education. I was as mild as I could have, really, but she did not appreciate it. She stared at me as though I had denigrated her whole life. I could almost feel her rage pouring off her. She turned around and called me a spoilt brat who didn't know how blessed I was or how difficult it was for her, which is really ridiculous since we grew up in the same house under the same parents. There was nothing privileged about it. Both of us had just to make do. But since I didn't instantly support her, I suppose in her mind I was the enemy. She then aimed this wild accusation at me. She said something like, "You think you're much better than me, don't you? You are merely pitiful, though, and someday everyone will see it." At the time, I dismissed it as she was merely acting out of rage. She should cool off, I advised her. We could discuss it when her emotional level dropped. I then turned from the room. I wasn't going to sit there and let her trash me for holding a different view. I assumed that was it when she bolted from the house. She would cool off, perhaps stay angry for a few days, but finally it would pass. That is simply her natural state. But the next morning I was woken up by my mum, who looked really upset. She told me that Jade and her mum were downstairs and they needed to talk to me. I was confused, but figured it was something to do with Jade's argument with her mum. So I threw on a shirt and went downstairs. Not even remotely prepared for what was coming. Jade was sitting on the couch, head in her hands, her mum's arm around her. My parents were standing nearby, looking absolutely shell-shocked. The whole vibe in the room was tense, like something major had happened and everyone was waiting for me. I was about to ask what was going on when Jade started crying, saying she couldn't believe what I'd done to her. Her mum was glaring at me, and my dad looked like he was going to faint. I tried to get them to slow down to tell me what was going on, but Jade just kept saying how I'd crossed a line and how she was so traumatized. And then she threw it out there that I had assaulted her. I couldn't even respond. I was that shocked. I just stood there, my mind racing, trying to process what she just said before I could defend myself. Her mum was on me, yelling that I was a monster and that she couldn't believe I'd do something like this. My dad grabbed me by the shoulders and just looked me in the eye. I could see the doubt, the anger, and it broke something inside me. He told me to own up to what I did and apologize. Apologize for something I didn't even do. I started explaining that Jade was lying, that nothing happened, but nobody was listening to me. Then, in the middle of my parents and her mum freaking out, I got mad. I mean, really mad. I picked up a nearby vase, not even thinking, and smashed it against the wall just to get everyone to stop yelling. It got their attention, but not in a good way. My dad immediately shoved me back, saying I was acting violent and told me to go to my room. I ended up locked in my room for hours, pacing, fuming, trying to figure out what I was going to do. How could they just believe her without a second thought? I'd never done anything to make them doubt me before. I had no idea what Jade's angle was, but I was sure she was lying. I just didn't know why she'd go to this extreme. That day was the longest day of my life. I stayed in that room until my dad came in and told me Jade and her mum had left. But I knew this wasn't over. The look in his eyes said it all. He thought I was guilty, that his son was some sort of monster. I tried to explain again, but he shut me down, saying that he didn't want to hear any more lies. And just like that, my world started crumbling. The day after that awful accusation, things went downhill faster than I thought was even possible. I thought maybe my folks would cool off, giving me a chance to explain things fully. I figured they'd at least sit down with me, genuinely talk it out. But that was just me being naively hopeful. By daylight, any prospect of reasoning with them was out the window. I barely slept that night, simply looking at my ceiling, repeating every tiny detail that had happened. I kept hoping that maybe somehow this was all a horrible dream, and that I'd wake up and everything would be normal again. But no. Early the next morning, my dad walked into my room and he had this serious, almost disgusted look on his face. He hardly looked at me, just ordered me to come downstairs and that Jade and her mum were going to handle things as soon as I got downstairs. It was the same sight as previously. Jade on the sofa looking all broken, her mum alongside her, and my parents looking absolutely distraught. I wanted to shout. It seemed like I'd wandered into some kind of intervention, but I was the one getting assaulted, like I was this evil they all had to deal with before I even sat down. My dad started this speech about how Jade was feeling unsafe and how she could not be near me anymore. They seemed to have chosen a course of action without even allowing me to voice opinions. He dropped it next. I was being sent off. Thinking he was not serious, I chuckled. "You're kicking me out over a lie, really?" Trying to keep my voice under control, I inquired, but he didn't reply. Just stared at me with this icy demeanor as like he didn't even know who I was now. Though she didn't say anything in my defense, my mother turned aside and I could tell she was weeping. Starting to beg, I said I didn't do anything, that Jade was fabricating things, but it was like talking to a wall. Jade sat there staring at me with these depressed little looks, as if she was some sort of victim. Her mother was caressing her back and murmuring that it would be well. At last, my dad cut me off and advised me that my disappearance for a little would be the only way they may prevent more shame. They previously agreed with Jade and her mother that they wouldn't go to the police should I leave town. That was the bargain. Go away, I inquired. Where ought I to be going? It was then that they mentioned my Aunt Dot. My aunt was not quite the friendly, inviting kind now. Our family knew her as the austere one, and if they didn't have to, nobody ever hung about with her. She essentially lived alone in this peaceful small town, a few hours away. Though I hardly knew her and hadn't seen her in years, Allegedly, that would be where I would be secure to prevent Jade from seeing me and experiencing her pain. I went crazy when I knew they were dead serious. I warned them I wouldn't allow them toss me off to some arbitrary relative like I was garbage. "Real chilly," my dad replied, looking at me. "You have no choice." He dropped the last blow on me then. Part of the compensation they were also providing Jade with was her education money that eluded me even in processing. All the money my parents had accumulated for my future, my education fund. Just pass it to her to help her to remain silent. With all I had worked toward, it felt like they were paying her off with my life. I simply stood there astounded while they all spoke around me as like I wasn't even there. Eventually, I simply stopped chatting. I don't even know how long I stood there until I understood my dad was essentially waiting for me to pack up and go. No space for compromise, no conversation. That was all they wanted, that I be gone. Every time I glanced at my mother, she seemed to want to say something but would just turn away. Like she could not manage facing me with nothing to say. I walked upstairs and got to work packing. I seemed to be gliding across water. My thoughts blank. I packed clothing, some books, a few items dear to me. I had no idea if I would ever be let back or how long I would be gone. I therefore took everything I would have wanted if I were leaving permanently. Though I could not make out what my parents were saying, I could hear their faint voices below. I momentarily considered perhaps they might come up. Perhaps they would come to see how ridiculous this all was and have change of opinion. Still, they did not. Nobody turned up. They arrived on my door many hours later and said it was time to go. My aunt had promised to look after me, and they had already given her a call informing her I was en route. They let me say farewell to no one at all, saying that vanishing meant no interaction with anyone from my life here. They grabbed my phone. How I was going to inform my pals eluded me. Just explain why I disappeared. It made no difference to them. They instructed me to be ready in half an hour and pack whatever else I might need. I had never felt in my life such captivity and powerlessness. Carrying my belongings, I left the home and could feel my dad watching me from the doorway, as if he were verifying my genuine departure. Not even wanting to see me off. My mother was inside someplace. Jade and her mother had already departed, and I recall having this weird sense of emptiness, like my entire existence had been deleted in one day. The vehicle trip to my aunt's was quiet and drawn out. My dad drove and spoke hardly at all the entire time. I believe I questioned him once, maybe twice, whether he truly believed Jade over me, but he simply tightened his hold on the wheel and turned away from me. My thoughts a turmoil. I watched out the window and kept wondering what I was meant to do. Currently, without help or a strategy, how could I start from nothing? When we at last arrived at my aunt's house, it was like being dropped off at a prison. Her apartment felt so lonely. It was little, rather run down with this ancient fence surrounding it. Now, I was meant to live in exile after not seeing her in years, all for a lie. My dad left me to handle my things alone, not even strolled me to the door. "We're doing this for your own benefit," he continued, and left standing there watching him head out without turning around. I could feel this great wrath boiling within of me, like some criminal, my own family. The ones meant to have my back had tossed me away. And for what purpose? In order to keep Jade content, to spare oneself from humiliation. Though I wanted to yell, weep, hit anything, I held back. I just stood there, clutching my suitcases and felt very alone. Right then, this was my life. Cut off from every person I have ever known, all from a falsehood I was unable to counter. I stood at my aunt's door knocking. She also lacked even a grin as she opened it. Just instructed me to come in after looking at me both up and down. And that's how I came out here in the middle of nowhere, sitting like a weight in my chest, betrayed by my family and with only a few suitcases. The worst sensation in the world. And I had no clue if it would ever get any better. Living with my aunt was difficult. She never definitely wanted me there, in my opinion. She did not state it straightforwardly, but she had to. The second I entered the door, she gave me a tight-lipped glance and pointed down the corridor to this little room, just large enough for a bed and a dresser. She murmured something about how she was doing my parents a favor and that I should behave myself. Nice. Good welcome, correct? Not quite nasty, though, was my aunt. Simply chilly. She didn't appreciate any kind of departure from her own rigorous approach of accomplishing things. At 6 o'clock meals, concise, not a single sound after 9, guests not present, constantly. I cannot even utilize several refrigerator shelves or access the thermostat or TV. She had this entire system, and God help me should I inadvertently tamper with it. To be honest, it felt like living in a cage, and it was not nearly the worst aspect. It was very terrible to be alone. Living in this small village almost in the middle of nowhere, there were hardly any stores, no social scene, only a few petrol stations and several fast food restaurants. I knew no one, and I wasn't exactly free to stay in touch with those from my former life. That was very evident from my parents. They had taken my phone, so I had nothing. No emails, no numbers. At first, I simply sulked about two offended and damaged people trying to be useful. Spending most of my days looking out the window, I felt bad about myself, kept reliving everything in my brain trying to find where it all went wrong. I was furious, like deep down wrath developing in my stomach, slightly enraged. Though I wanted to yell at my parents, Jade, and everyone else who had turned their backs on me, I was powerless. Trying to decide what the hell to do next, I was caught in this strange limbo. A few weeks later, though, I knew I had to leave the house, if only to prevent going crazy. It was really evident from my aunt that she had no desire in supporting me beyond just providing a house. She would make tiny remarks about responsibility and pulling my weight and leave employment brochures for around the home laying about. She seemed to be trying to make it so unpleasant that I would simply get the signal and go. I thus made the only action I could think of: get a job and begin to save to go. Given no college cash and no contacts out here, I had few choices. I applied at several companies, especially in retail and food service, but nothing turned up until I found employment as a warehouse worker. Though not glitzy, it was something. The job was terrible. Hours long, soaked in sweat and dirt, I scarcely able to raise my arms when home. I stayed with it nevertheless, as it provided a purpose for me to leave my aunt's house every day and included some cash in my pocket. The nicest thing about it is I was not alone myself in suffering. I got to know other colleagues about my age who were working through personal problems. Derek, one of the guys, was working 2 shifts to pay off some debt. Then there was James, who had arrived in town in order to flee a family situation that seemed nearly as disorganized as mine. We connected very rapidly since we were all broke, hard-working and bored. A few months later, we developed a strategy. We would pool our funds, locate a reasonably priced apartment, and leave our deplorable living conditions. I was in full attendance. Anything improved over living with my aunt, so we worked for weeks gathering every dime we could. To save, eat nothing except dollar store snacks and ramen. At last we came upon a run-down little flat just barely large enough for the 3 of us. Still, it was our. Though it was only a small bit, moving out felt like recovering my independence. Though we didn't give a damn about the location, a dump. Our second-hand couch was probably older than all of us together, an inexpensive table and several mismatched seats. Not much, but for the first time in years I felt as though I could breathe once again. Naturally, things were not quite flawless sailing. A grind is living on your own while broke. Most of the time we seldom saw each other. We all worked lengthy shifts, alternately night and day employment. But the times when we were all home at once sprawled on the sofa, eating a cheap pizza or grumbling about our terrible jobs, made the effort worthwhile. We would rave about our families, our companies, and everything else that was messing us over. It resembled our own small gang of therapists. A few more months later, I began to see I could indeed create a life here. Though it was nothing like the life I had intended for myself, it was something. At the warehouse, I was elevated to a supervisor post, which meant a bit more, but not very much. With that extra money, though, I began saving for items I had been lacking. Like a passable phone. Once I had one again, I thought about contacting folks from my former life, but I kept second-guessing. Though another part of me was still too furious and too heartbroken to even begin those talks. Part of me wanted to reconnect, to tell everyone the truth. Rather, I gave my new life first priority. Just putting my toe back into the whole educational scene, I registered for some evening classes at the neighborhood community college. It was something, not the degree I had in mind or the dream university. It also provided me a motivation to stay on, to keep saving and attempting to create a life that was really mine, not something my family's problems pushed into. Though I discovered tiny moments of delight here and there, life was hardly simple. Derek and James grew more like brothers than roommates, and we supported one another through difficult times. Should one of us have a bad day, the other two would bring inexpensive beverages or munchies. Well, not for me, since I'm off that. We would gather around discussing the future and attempting to picture a life outside daily grind. We seemed to need one another to keep on. To keep in mind, something greater was only waiting for us. Sometimes I would catch myself still resentful, still thinking about Jade and my family and wondering how they could have simply tossed me away like that. At least momentarily, I was learning nevertheless how to ignore such ideas. Now I had my own existence, a small bubble of individuals who truly loved me and treated me differently than a criminal. I felt maybe, just maybe, I might make it through for the first time since all this started. At last, things seemed under control. Though I had my own schedule, a few close friends, and I was even somewhat improving in my working classes, life wasn't ideal. Though I wasn't exactly happy, I was surviving, and it was a hell of a lot more than I would have believed I would be doing a year earlier. One Tuesday night at random, while I was returning from work, my phone buzzed with an email alert. Though something prompted me to check, I almost disregarded it. Coming from my dad was this. Since they deposited me at my aunt's place, my family hadn't spoken once. Telling myself I was better off without them, I attempted to ignore them from my mind. But receiving that email hit me like a gut strike. I stood there gazing at the screen, wondering whether I ought to even open it. Part of me wanted to act as though they didn't exist, erase it right away. But I clicked on curiosity as it won out. The little message was really short. According to my dad, there had been some fresh developments and he wanted to reconnect. He said Jade had at last gone clean about what had transpired, just as such, like it was some minute detail. Unlike she hadn't flipped my entire existence upside down, my brain was trying to organize it. Jade had come clean about lying. The narrative opened up as I continued reading. Apparently her boyfriend, someone I knew nothing about or cared about, recorded her discussing the entire incident. I'm not sure if she had been chatting to one of her pals, or perhaps him. Still, the key was she acknowledged she made everything up. She said she wanted to teach me a lesson, so she did it, that he deserved it after I had corrected her that day. The whole situation had spun out of control more quickly than she could have imagined. She couldn't back down either by the time she understood how far things had gone. The worst thing about it is like he was almost justifying it. My dad's email tone seemed to be, she was sorry, he said, but she was handling personal problems and didn't understand the effect. I stood there shocked. Really, she had no idea the impact. She took my whole life, wrecked everything, and they were acting as like it was only a small error of childhood. And her parents, the ones meant to know me better than anybody, had believed her, without a doubt, saying he wanted to catch up and that he hoped I would understand and proceed as if he hadn't abandoned me. My dad ended the email. The second things got difficult, as if they hadn't driven me into exile and deprived me of everything. By the time I was through reading, I was shivering with rage. I answered nothing. I was unable. I sat there allowing the truth of it all to sink in. When Derek and James returned home, they observed something was strange. I first shrugged aside their inquiries about if I was okay. Before I could even begin to explain, I needed to calm down. I was too fired up and too upset. I hardly slept that night. The whole incident kept running over in my head. Every time I begged my parents, every time they looked at me as like I were a monster, all of it came flying back. This time adding even another degree of treachery. I told Derek and James all the next morning. I started with the allegation, the desertion, all the garbage with my aunt, the warehouse job, and lastly the email from my dad. Their faces changed from amazement to rage as I went over what Jade had done and how my family had treated me. They listened without interrupting. She just confessed it because Derek shook his head, appearing like he wanted to strike something after I finished. And right now they're behaving as though you should simply forget it ever occurred, I answered, trying not to let my voice waver in exactly that manner, like it was no great thing. James fixed me a stern glance. You ought to inform all of them. People have to be informed of truth. You have been evading Guy. Even after they cut you off, you have let them run your life. He was right, as I knew. Fearful to even reach out to old acquaintances because of what my family may say, I had been living in the shadows, always peering over my shoulder. Even from far away, I had been allowing them control over my life. But considering addressing everyone and trying to explain what occurred, it was terrible. Still, a strategy began to take shape while I sat there with Derek and James. Later that week, I sent a reply to his email. I kept it brief, just sufficient to let him know I was done acting as their scapegoat. I told him I wasn't interested in moving on unless it meant telling everyone the truth. I needed my family to own their actions to me. Though I was still too offended to appreciate it, I pushed submit and felt this odd combination of relief and wrath, like I would have finally broken free. A few days later, I received yet another email, this one from my mother. She was begging me, arguing that I didn't have to go public and that family concerns belong inside the family. She implored me to consider Jade and her delicate condition. It seemed absurd. She was still having her sentiments subordinated to all else. I presented the email to Derek and James even knowing the truth, and they essentially urged me to forward the email to everyone I needed to clean my name so I could recover the life Jade had taken that evening. For first time in years, I signed on to social media. I had turned away from it, afraid about what others would think, haunted by all the falsehoods they most likely accepted. Still, this time I was not hiding. I left a lengthy message covering all from beginning to end. About Jade's allegations, I spoke the truth. The reaction with my parents, being transferred to live with my aunt and all the hardships I had gone through since then, I didn't hold back. People wanted to know what I had gone through, the loneliness and the treachery. They helped me to see that I was not the monster my family had created. My heart thumping, I sat there gazing at the screen once I pushed submit. I was momentarily regretful about it, questioning whether I had made a major error. Then, though, the reaction began to flow. Messages from far-off relatives, former acquaintances, even someone I hardly knew, all stretching out in astonishment and encouragement. On my behalf, people were outraged, horrified at what Jade had done and how my family had treated me. Though it was overpowering, it seemed as though a weight had at once offloaded from my shoulders. The support never stopped in the next days. People were seeing the truth and at last hearing my perspective. And I thought I could breathe for the first time in years. I was not concealing anymore. The days after the truth's publication were a combination of anarchy and relief. Notifications from old friends, relatives, and even some acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years exploded on my phone. People startled one another, wrathful, advocating, mixed. It was all over the board, but it felt great, like others were seeing my side for the first time in a very long period. I felt neither drowning in a falsehood nor as though I was. Some of the responses came from relatives who had realized something was strange, but hadn't connected it all until they came across my post. A couple said they were sorry they hadn't gotten in touch sooner, that they had accepted whatever narrative my parents had offered them. Some relatives even claimed they had been advised I had gone away to clear my brain following some personal crises. The cover-up had been far more extensive than I had thought, and my resentment only deepened knowing how much they had lied merely to silence me and make themselves look good. There then was the other side of it. Furious were my parents and Jade's mother. They emailed me saying I had destroyed Jade's life and betrayed the family. They said I was being harsh for pulling up past problems solely to harm everyone, and even suggested I was doing this when Jade was fighting. To be honest, reading their messages hardly registered with me anymore. Over and over it was the same stuff. Then putting Jade's emotions first over all else. They couldn't understand how ridiculous they sounded supporting her when she had practically lied to destroy my life. They were so ignorant to the damage she had done. I chose to block them all. I was finished. Instead, they doubled down, even though I had given them every opportunity to come clean, to recognize their mistakes. At last, I was in charge of my life, free from their continual meddling or sense of guilt for some part of everything. Jade's life rapidly fell once all came out. Her support from others has faded. Everyone in our hometown knew she had lied about something major solely to destroy my life and get her way. Once the truth leaked out, word got to her not too long ago. Friends, instructors, former classmates. Everyone turned away from her. People began handling her as though she were radioactive. To be honest, I can't say she wasn't deserving. Mother of Jade was utterly appalled. She believed every word her daughter's account from the beginning. And now the entire community was viewing her as having produced some sort of monster. She eventually could not bear the guilt or the repercussions. People were telling her straight out they had no interest in her, as long as Jade was in view. Her mother made apologies here and there to attempt to smooth things up, but it made little difference. Damage had been done. People turned off by it. It grew worse the more people learned. At last, Jade's mother disowned her after she had her breaking moment. It seemed to me a combination of guilt and bitterness. She most likely felt used to her own daughter pulling her into this mess, so she seemed like an enabler to something so horrible. Coming back from that is not simple. Jade arrived with no one in her corner. Her mother had kicked her from the house, I had heard. She was essentially alone, caught trying to cope with the consequences of her own conduct, and no one wanted to support her, with everyone in town avoiding her and her own mother severing relations. Jade had to leave without option. Initially, assuming things would blow over, she tried to hang about, but folks wouldn't let it go. She would receive looks, murmurs, folks chatting behind her back everywhere she went. She tried to make apologies to others, but they turned her away. She clearly could not remain, not if she had any chance of a life free from continual criticism and isolation. Jade packed finally and left town. I'm not sure her destination was. To be honest, I'm not very interested. She opted to wreck my life instead after getting her shot. She is now the one facing fallout from her falsehoods. And based on what I have heard, she is totally alone. Finally behind me, all of it. I became concentrated on the life I had created here. There, through it all, Derek and James kept me grounded and reminded me that I wasn't alone. It was odd after years of feeling alone, yet consoling to know I had friends in my life. We had gone through so much in that horrible tiny apartment, and now that things were calm, I felt more near to them than ever. I began corresponding with several people from my former life who had contacted me following my post about that period. A few of them had relocated to a nearby city and asked me to pay a weekend visit. Originally, It seemed strange, like re-entering a life I had left behind. Still, it felt fantastic as well. Inquiring about my work, my classes, and the people I had met, they were actually curious in what I had been doing. There was no awkwardness or pity calls. They just appeared content to have me back off. That weekend helped me to understand exactly how much I had lost from a regular social life. People who knew me from before everything collapsed. It seemed like a piece of myself I had forgotten I had dropped was at last finding her way back. The finest thing was that I could at last be really honest about everything, not one more secret, no longer secret. The true tale was heard by my buddies, not the one my family had twisted and distributed about.